Hey guys, and welcome to day 19 of Lent. Today we're looking at Jesus goes to the tomb, John chapter 11 verses 28 to 37. Martha went back and called her sister Mary. "The teacher has come," she said to her privately, "and he's asking for you." When she heard that, she got up quickly and went to him. Jesus hadn't yet arrived in the village. He was still in the place where Martha had met him. The Judeans who were in the house with Mary consoling her saw her get up quickly and go out. They guessed that she was going to the tomb to weep there, and they followed her. When Mary came to where Jesus was, she saw him and fell down at his feet. "Master," she said, "if only you'd been here, my brother wouldn't have died." When Jesus saw her crying, and the Judeans who had come with her crying, he was deeply stirred in his spirit and very troubled. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Master," they said, "come and see." Jesus burst into tears. "Look," said the Judeans, "see how much he loved him." "Well, yes," some of them said, "but he opened the eyes of a blind man, didn't he? Couldn't he have done something to have stopped the fellow from dying?" One of the greatest cultural divides in today's world is the different ways in which we do funerals. In many parts of the world, people still mourn their dead in much the same way that they did in Jesus' day. There are processions carrying the coffin along the streets to the place of burial or cremation. Everyone, particularly the women, cries and wails. There is wild, sad music. The process of grief is well and truly launched. One person's grief communicates to another. It's part of the strange business of being human, and when we are with very sad people, their sadness infects us, even if we don't share their particular grief. The psychologists would point out that we all carry deep griefs of one sort or another, and these come to the surface when we are with others who have more immediate reason for sorrow. In other cultures, not least in the secularized world of the modern West, we have learned to hide our emotions. I well remember visiting an old lady whose husband had died after more than 40 years of marriage. She was busying herself with the arrangements, making phone calls, sorting out the clothes, wondering what she should wear at the funeral. On the day itself, she was bright and perky, putting on a good show for her family and friends. She was with us as she went for a cup of tea afterwards, chatting cheerfully, not wanting anyone else to be upset. I couldn't help feeling that the older way, the way of most of the world to this day, is actually kinder. It doesn't do any good to hide grief or pretend that it doesn't exist. When Paul says that he doesn't want us to grieve like people who have no hope, he doesn't mean that he doesn't want us to grieve at all. He means that there are two sorts of grief: a hopeless grief and a hopeful grief. Hopeful grief is still grief. It can still be very, very bitter. As though to rub this point in, we find Jesus in the passage bursting into tears. It's one of the most remarkable moments in the whole gospel story. There can be no doubt of its historical truth. Nobody in the early church, venerating Jesus and celebrating his own victory over death, would have invented such a thing. But we shouldn't miss the levels of meaning that John intends us to see within it. To begin with, we should not rest content, as some older writers did, with treating Jesus' tears as evidence that he was a real human being, not just a divine playing at being human. That is no doubt true, but nobody in Jesus' world imagined he was anything other than a real flesh and blood human being, with emotions like everyone else. Rather, throughout the Gospel, John is telling us something much more striking, that when we look at Jesus, not least when we look at Jesus in tears, we are seeing not just a flesh and blood human being, but the Word made flesh. The Word through whom the worlds were made, weeps like a baby at the grave of his friend. Only when we stop and ponder will we understand the full mystery of John's Gospel. Only when we put away our high and dry pictures of who God is and replace them with pictures in which the Word, who is God, can cry with the world's crying, will we discover that the word God really means. Jesus bursts into tears the moment he sees Mary and all the Judeans with her in tears. He has borne our griefs, said the prophet, and carried out our sorrows. Jesus doesn't sweep into the scene, as we might have supposed, and as later Christians inventing such a story would almost certainly have told us, and declare that tears are beside the point, that Lazarus is not dead, only asleep. Even though, as his actions and words will shortly make clear, Jesus has no doubt what he will do, and what his Father will do through him. There is no sense of triumphalism, or someone coming in smugly with a secret formula that will show how clever he is. There is, rather, the man of sorrows, acquainted with our grief and pain, sharing and bearing it to the point of tears. What grief within Jesus' own heart was stirred by the tears of Mary and the crowd? We can only guess, but among those guesses we must place not a grief for other deaths in the past, but a grief for a death still to come, his own. This passage points us forward to the questions that will be asked at Jesus' own death. Couldn't the man who did so many signs have brought it about that he himself didn't have to die? Couldn't the one who saved so many have in the end saved himself? John is telling us the answer by 1,000 hints and images throughout his book. It is only through his death, it is only through his own sharing of the common fate of humanity that the world can be saved. There is a line straight on from Jesus' tears in verse 35 to the death in which Jesus will share not only the grief, but also the doom of the world. But there is also a hint of what will then follow. Where have you laid him? Jesus asks Mary and the others. They have taken away my master, says Mary Magdalene, just a week or two later, and I don't know where they have laid him. Listen to the echoes between the story of Lazarus and that of Jesus himself. That's part of the reason why John has told the story at all. The other Gospels don't have it. Some have suggested that they were anxious to protect Lazarus from the sort of unwelcome attention indicated. Presumably, this danger was past by the time John was writing. Come and see, they respond, as Jesus had responded to the early disciples' inquiry as to where he was staying. It is the simplest of invitations, and yet it goes to the heart of the Christian faith. Come and see, we say to Jesus as we lead him, all tears to the place of our deepest grief and sorrow. Come and see, he says to us in reply, as he leads us through the sorrow to the place where he now dwells in the light and love and resurrection glory. So, for reflection, consider the significance of Jesus shedding tears at the grave of Lazarus. How does this moment reveal the depth of Jesus' humanity and his identification with human suffering? I think death is probably the most extreme human emotion, particularly at the very instance of it or the near aftermath. And this just shows that Jesus was completely human as well as completely God. But why was it important for Jesus, the Word made flesh, to experience and share in our grief and pain? I think so that we could relate to him, because we didn't have and we don't have the minds incredible enough or incomparable enough to understand and relate to something so far above ourselves, which is why he came to be one of us so that we might see. And how does this shape your understanding of God's character and his presence in times times of sorrow. Let me know what you think. Have a good day.